Wow, this house is cute. But can I really get in the game in this economy? I do have savings, and I am responsible-ish. Ugh, I should bury it. I'm being wild. But what if I'm not being wild, though? Could I actually score a...
Kick off your home buying journey with Zillow's new BuyAbility tool. It makes it easy to find out what you can afford, so you can get off the bench and onto the playing field with confidence. Check your BuyAbility, only on Zillow.
Hey, this is Bill Simmons from the Bill Simmons Podcast, here to tell you that Michelob Ultra is giving you the chance to win tickets to the NBA Finals. That's right, the 2025 NBA Finals. Just head to michelobultra.com/NBA Finals. Michelob Ultra courtside NBA Finals sweepstakes. No purchase necessary. Open to U.S. residents, excluding Maryland residents. 21 up. Begins at 9 a.m. EST on February 16, 2025. Ends on May 5th, 2025. See official rules at michelobultra.com/rules for price and details. Message and data rates may apply. Void where prohibited.
Welcome to Fortune's Wheel Podcast, and this is our second episode in our brand new series outlining the foundations of medieval philosophy, beginning long before there was any sense of what we call Western today. On this episode, we take a few minutes to outline why Socrates was the way he was, and why his life ended the way it did. Philosophy, to some degree, is a reflection of one's world, one's circumstances, and if I try to preach anything on this show, it's that context matters. We won't always do a history episode in this philosophy series, but I just strongly feel that one cannot truly understand the monumental thinking of Socrates without understanding his monumentally important world. Here's that story. Now, before we begin, please consider joining us on Patreon, where you can enjoy more than 20 hours of bonus content as of this recording for as low as just $1 a month. Join our growing community and help this show bring our shared story to life. This is our philosophy episode 2, entitled Socrates in Context. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy the show. Socrates. As I said in the last episode, there are few names in history that hold such weight and prominence as Socrates. American transcendentalist philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson once said, quote, "Socrates, the master of those who know," end quote. Well, none of us like to be left out in the cold, so let's figure out what those who know actually know, huh? What was it about Socrates that has fascinated people of all walks of life for literal millennia? What was it about this man that prompted one of the giants of the Roman Republic, Marcus Tullius Cicero, to emphatically proclaim, quote, "Socrates was the first to call philosophy down from the heavens, placing it in cities and even introducing it into homes, forcing it to examine life and morality, good and evil," end quote. And in line with the aims of this podcast, all of this bit about Socrates, as well as all the myriad other pre-Christian thinkers we're going to cover on this first round of our philosophy series, well, this will all be building up to how medieval thought and theology was shaped. To think that philosophy that existed before the life of Jesus of Nazareth was inconsequential is quite simply wrong, right, at best. With respect to the pre-Socratics on the last episode, Western thinking was founded with this man right here, a man who St. Augustine of Hippo, one of the top 5 Christian thinkers of all time, once described as, quote-unquote, "the first to turn the whole of philosophy toward the reformation and regulation of morals, whereas before him the philosophers had directed their inquiries solely to the physics of nature." Boethius, in his famous Consolation of Philosophy, portrayed Socrates as the man who met death with courage and reason. And another top fiver in Christian thinking, St. Thomas Aquinas, referenced the old Athenian in his Summa Theologiae when discussing moral virtue and prudence. Christianity was directly influenced by Socrates, as it was directly influenced by those thinkers who came from Socrates. And to think, the towering figure in Western philosophy's legacy actually began with a cup of hemlock. Let's head back to the Athenian prison, a cell in the year 399 BC. It was here that a group of men, some young, some older, watched their respected teacher drink his cup of hemlock. The scene, as written in Plato's Phaedo, is actually pretty heart-wrenching, namely the part where Socrates, holding his cup, merely smiled at his students, his friends, gathered in that dark, dank, smelly hole of a dungeon before drinking the contents full. This death still echoes down to us today. It's a very familiar and relatable story, this question of whether any of us are truly willing to give our lives for our principles, for our ideas. And without Plato, we may never have known about this man in his entirety. Well, there was another Athenian man, a playwright named Aristophanes, who wrote about him, but he just made fun of the philosopher in a play called Clouds. As in, Socrates walked aimlessly around Athens all day with his head in the clouds. To think that this might be the only thing we have about Socrates makes one think about all the other great minds throughout history who just didn't have the same public relations. All those minds we will never know about. I know they existed. But Plato, again, Socrates' student and friend, Plato did write Socrates' teachings down for us. And he treated Socrates far better than Aristophanes did. And it would be through Plato's lens that millennia of people around the world would come to know Socrates. So, through the eyes of Plato, who was this guy exactly? Born in the town of Allopeki, within the city-state of Athens' domain of influence, Socrates was the son of a stonemason named Sophroniscus and a midwife named Phanerete. Other than that, not much else is known about his childhood. Now, as for the world at large, we know far, far more, and this world would shape this boy into arguably the greatest philosopher in Western history, maybe of all history. Born just 20 years after the famous Battle of Marathon, his boyhood saw the rise of one of Athens' greatest leaders, a man named Pericles. Under Pericles, Athens reached the peak of its cultural and military power. Indeed, this was the era of the powerful Athenian Empire, which, to be clear, was about 2 generations before Alexander the Great's even mightier Macedonian Empire. Now, in large part, thanks to Pericles, the Athenian Empire controlled what was called the Delian League, which was initially formed to defend against Persia, but increasingly became a tool to expand Athenian dominance over the other Greek city-states, eventually bumping up against the infamous Spartans by the time Socrates was an old man. This period of Greek history under Pericles' leadership is known as the Golden Age of Athens. Socrates walked the streets of Athens during this Golden Age. Now, also during this time, Pericles introduced Athens, and the world, I suppose, to the idea of direct democracy, where male citizens over the age of 20 years participated in government. This, of course, came with strings attached, namely the one about fighting and dying for Athens, should it come to it. Pericles' direct democracy, well, it was a radical change of pace from a system that only had the highest male elite in Athens ultimately making the decisions. For our purposes here, it's crucial that we know that this form of direct democracy brought with it the practice of ostracism, meaning the citizens could vote to exile someone indefinitely, or for a period of 10 years, depending on what level of threat to their democracy they were deemed. Yeah, ostracism. Hold on to that one. Direct democracy also had its pitfalls. It also led to demagoguery, where persuasive but unwise leaders swayed public opinion. Some things never quite change, do they? But by and large, Athenian culture thrived and flourished under Pericles, a highly respected general who led Athens between Socrates' ages of 9 and 41 years old. When Socrates was just a boy, some of those same philosophers we talked about in the last episode walked the earth, let alone the streets of Athens. When Socrates was 23 years old, in the year 447 BC, the world-famous Parthenon was completed. It's just amazing to think that Socrates watched this structure's massive columns being built from the ground up. And in the year 429 BC, when Socrates was 41 years old, the great Pericles died. Sophocles wrote Oedipus Rex. Euripides wrote the Bacchae and Heracles, which transformed art into something that reflected even the darker parts of human nature. Yeah, with Euripides, art got real, and Socrates was alive to witness it all in real time. And before we get into his actual philosophy, that will come on the next episode. There are a few major things to mention that shaped this man's destiny. The first occurred in Pericles' last few years. It was called the Peloponnesian War, which kicked off in the year 431 BC. Remember how I said that Athens had grown right up against Sparta? Yeah. Spartans really didn't care for that all that much. This war was a war for the ages, for the very hearts and minds and commerce and culture of the Peloponnese being the peninsula located at the southern tip of mainland Greece. It contained famous city-states like Sparta and Argos, Corinth, and Ithaca right off the western coast. Spartans saw the Athenians as soft, with all their culture and their prosperity and all their thinking. So, the Spartans attacked. The Peloponnesian War involved epic sea battles and devastating land battles, and believe it or not, the Athenians weren't as soft as the Spartans first thought. This war would encompass years and years, but it did have intervening periods of tenuous peace. And just 2 years into the war, Athens was struck by humanity's biggest enemy, disease. The plague of Athens initially hit in late 430 BC, but within a few months it had begun to ravage the entire population. Seriously, this plague was bad, and is one of the more documented accounts of ancient plagues, though we still have no real idea what caused it. Speculation ranges from smallpox to typhoid fever, based mostly on the writings of the eyewitness and another famous Athenian author, by the way, Thucydides, who reported high fever, a raspy voice, fits of extreme painful coughing, inflammation of membranes around the body, including the eyes and mouth and nostril, as well as whole body rashes and periodic retching and vomiting. It was nasty. It was bad. It's estimated that 25% of Athens perished between 430 and 427 BC, amounting to upwards of 100,000 people. And who do we already know died during these 3 years? Pericles. Yes, Pericles died of this mysterious plague right at the outset of the plague. The Peloponnesian War immediately shifted toward the spared Spartans, as Athens never quite recovered from that loss of life, the loss of their leader and the loss of morale. But it's worth noting that though we often depict Socrates as a pig-nosed, ugly, balding, pot-bellied man with soft round eyes, and there is some truth to that, we never seem to depict him how he was in his younger years. It turns out that in his 40s, Socrates willingly gave himself up for military service and was a highly decorated warrior during the Peloponnesian War. He was widely known for his courage and self-discipline, and that's mostly what made him a household name in his later years. Now, we don't know every battle he engaged in, but we know he was at the Battle of Potidaea in 432 BC, the Battle of Amphipolis in 424 BC, and the famous Athenian victory at the Battle of Delium in 422 BC. After Delium, we don't know exactly, when Socrates left military service, but to be fair, at Delium, he would have been 48 years old. He would have been a 48-year-old hoplite. So a hoplite, just for the record, was a highly disciplined, expertly trained, and enormously lethal warrior, akin to those Spartans who we are so familiar with. And I mean, the guy was banging on the door of 50. So after he left the life of a hoplite, Socrates lived in Athens for the rest of his days. And it was during this time that he was an eyewitness to the steep decline. It was rapid. The steep decline of Athenian democracy, and thus the Athenian Golden Age. After Pericles, the city had no central hero upon which to place their trust. So, the demagoguery mentioned earlier began to rear its ugly head. This was the rise of two things that would shape Socrates' thinking going forward. One was popular opinion in governance, and the second, something called sophistry. Now, in Socrates' Athens of the early 400s, direct democracy shifted to something closer to pure democracy, which is akin to mob rule. And the demagoguery that was always threatening from the outside of that system began to quickly seep its way in, resulting in a man named Alcibiades. You're going to hear a lot about him even in the next episode. So hold on to Alcibiades. Before 411 BC, Alcibiades was once one of Socrates' friends and students. But in that year, Alcibiades rose to a powerful voice. He was charismatic, ambitious, handsome beyond belief, and a war hero. A general, actually. He came with quite a bit of baggage, though. He was notorious for switching allegiances between Athens, Sparta, and even Persia. Ultimately, he was assassinated in exile in the year 404 BC by the Spartans, but not after leading Athens into some pretty cataclysmic failures. Socrates watched it all happen. He watched a former student lead Athens down a terrible path, a path that took it right to the edge of imperial collapse. And this impact on his thinking was undeniable. And despite his military reputation that made him recognizable and respected around Athens, during the 410s and 400s, Socrates developed the following that included the likes of Plato and, again, Alcibiades. And it is, in my estimation, that we find two paths in Athens one could take. You could stay with Socrates and continue to practice and develop ways in which one can self-reflect and improve through the use of dialectic and philosophy, all that, right? We're going to learn all that on the next episode. Or the other path is you could follow the sophists. Plato, of course, stayed with Socrates and went on to change the world in his own ways, not least by documenting his wise teacher's lessons. Alcibiades, who left Socrates, decided to follow a sophist. Sophistry. So, what is that? Sophistry, in truth, had been around for quite some time already. But sophistry as a business model had become quite popular in those days. And business was good during the Athenian Golden Age. But again, what is it? What is sophistry? Sophists are professional teachers. Yeah, I know. Ironic coming from me. Sophists were professional teachers of rhetoric. Crap. I'm an English teacher. Okay, let's try it again from a different angle. Sophists were professional teachers who taught rhetoric, who also claimed to teach virtue, but often prioritized persuasion over truth. That's a little better. So sophistry has come to mean the use of fallacious arguments, especially with the intention of deceiving. This was precisely how Socrates saw it, a fallacious perversion of another's thinking and understanding and communication with others. Each sophist advertised himself as an expert in one subject area, maybe two. These included philosophy, rhetoric, music, mathematics, and the law. These were highly learned and intellectual people, but they made an art out of teaching people how to manipulate others and other situations to their benefit. It became dishonest and superficial. Quite quickly, actually. Many of these sophists would sweep into town, be hired out to teach a young man with a specific subject area or skill, and as an added bonus, this teacher would teach the students specific rhetorical tools to manipulate the conversation or debate. A sophist became less of a man of principle and more of a man of circumstance, a social or political chameleon. In today's political parlance, at least here in the States, we'd refer to this person as a flip-flopper, someone who changes his or her rhetoric, speech, and even whole stances on issues, depending on who he or she is addressing. The word disingenuous comes to my mind. Now, as an example, the famous sophist named Gorgias, which was actually the title of one of Plato's dialogues, as it's two main characters were Socrates and this very same Gorgias. The real Gorgias was a renowned sophist who wrote many treatises on various subjects. And being a sophist, he could, as they say, sell ketchup popsicle to a woman in white gloves on a hot summer day. Nothing was beyond his rhetorical reach. In one such treatise, he argued that nothing existed. Yeah, that's what he argued. Nothing existed. In another attempt, entitled Encomium of Helen, Gorgias lists all the myriad ways the Trojan War was a direct or an indirect result of Helen of Troy and no one else. But then, in the same book, Encomium of Helen, then, after proving each of these reasons correct, he systematically breaks each one down and proves them wrong in the same treatise. So the danger, as you've probably already surmised, is that you never actually know where these sophists stood on any issue. They were masters of telling you exactly what you wanted to hear. What's more is that these were some of the first who placed the art and gift of teaching into a quantifiable monetary value, completely undermining the nature of teaching others, which had seemed to have simply been a part of life. Sophists turned education into a trade. Sophists capitalized on ignorance. Socrates would have said that, instead of rejoicing in learning and improvement. Now, during the 420s and 410s, Athens ballooned with sophists, and these sophists were hired by the wealthy and influential Athenian families to train their sons in law and rhetoric and oratory. With this came an undermining and slow erosion of Athens' very democratic principles, and leading people to question what their own leaders were even telling them. Again, sounds awful familiar if you're listening to this in 2025. Socrates saw through it all, right from the outset, which is what Plato writes about in his dialogues. Athens suffered one devastating plague, decimating the human capital of its people. Within a decade, it quickly succumbed to another plague, a plague of its people's sense of trust in its leaders and institutions. Sophistry was that plague. Now, knowing this, one can easily understand the path of Alcibiades and how it led to the near collapse of the Athenian Empire. Now, watching it all unfold, Socrates slowly began to lose his trust in democracy itself. Well, truthfully, he was absolutely disgusted with Athenian governance by the 400s, seeing how much of his life was wasted relying on neighbors and fellow statesmen to collectively do the right things. Socrates, in short, had given up on Athenian democracy, seeing it as vile and ultimately futile. He pivoted his thoughts away from topics pertaining to ethical governments and toward the nature of virtue, or what they called in Greek, arete. Groups of people, he argued, were unstable and unreliable, but if one were to focus on oneself, and each of us did so with sincerity, then that was where Socrates felt ethical governance would derive from. Then came the year 404 BC. A Spartan-backed Athenian oligarch named Critias, known for extremist views on governance, created a ruling council of 30 oligarchs in Athens. Athens didn't really like that, as they had at least had a say in what happened there. But these 30 oligarchs, again, led by Critias, with funding and support from Sparta, went on an oppressive blood purge of the city in order to impose control. Around 1,500 Athenians were just slaughtered, seemingly overnight. And Socrates again watched it all happen around him. What's more heartbreaking, I suppose, is that Socrates himself was ordered to assist in an execution, but he flatly refused, risking his own life in the process. Now, you may be thinking something like, okay, what's he doing? This is supposed to be a philosophy series, not Greek history. What's this guy up to anyway? Here's what I'm getting at by going into all of this historical detail about the world Socrates inhabited. In the midst of all this, Socrates was an inflection point. All right, so what do I mean by that exactly? Socrates was a turning point in more ways than mere philosophy, and no one can truly understand his impact without at least having a cursory understanding of his world. It was a world of opposites: war and peace, plenty and plague, prosperity and tyranny, philosophy and sophistry. And Socrates marks this inflection point. With how he ended his life, it's safe to say that he marked it with an emphatic exclamation point. And as late as 1872, Friedrich Nietzsche, in his Birth of Tragedy, declared Socrates a radical disruptor of Greek tradition, stating, quote, "With Socrates, Greek taste veers round in favor of dialectics. What is clear, what is comprehensible, is to be valued more highly than what is beautiful," end quote. So with Socrates, Nietzsche would argue, rationalism begins to undermine traditional Greek values, including mythology and the arts. George Hegel, decades before Nietzsche, he declared, quote, "Socrates is the turning point of history. He brings the principle of subjective thought to consciousness, separating it from the unconscious morality of earlier Greece," end quote. And with the help of his student Plato, Socrates became the pivot upon which Western philosophy shifted away from mere metaphysics and mythology and toward the realm of ethics and self-discovery. One might say that individualism, in the Western sense at least, got its first spark during the later years of Socrates' life. So that is the setup for the next episode. And on the next episode, we're going to outline several of Plato's dialogues and that basically outline Socrates' philosophy. And honestly, this is where the rubber meets the road. So I'll see you on the next one.